This guide is intended for both universities and accreditors and will highlight how accreditors review a university's accreditation submission to gather and then triangulate the information that is presented. This video guide will also highlight areas which may be challenging for universities to address in their submission and for accreditors to interpret during their review. First, an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of lands, seas and waters throughout Australia and pay respect to elders past, present and future. We recognise that the health and social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are grounded in continued connection to culture, country, language and community, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. In considering what accreditors look for, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. All accreditors will read the entire documentation in detail, but the starting point may differ across individuals. Many will start with your narrative, however some may start with your assessment mapping or your responses to each criterion in order to work backwards from there. Regardless, there are a number of key aspects that accreditors will specifically be looking for as they piece together their understanding of your program and your claims against the criteria. Many accreditors will begin their review of an accreditation submission by reading the narrative. This will provide a story about the speech pathology program and gives accreditors an initial understanding of the program before they review more detailed and specific evidence. Pages 6 to 7 of Part 2 discusses this further, but in essence, accreditors will be seeking from the narrative an executive summary with an integrated overview of program content and genuine reflections on the strengths and weaknesses of the program, with plans to address the weaknesses as required, a brief description of how student learning and assessment aligns with the professional standards, evidence of clear coverage of all components of communication and swallowing across the lifespan, and a brief explanation of how the program has been structured to assure that, upon graduation, students are ready for entry to the profession, evidence that the teaching pedagogy of the program is contemporary, makes use of cases and/or real-life scenarios, and addresses both local and global issues, evidence of how the program is developing culturally safe and responsive practice for both staff and students, an explanation of how transfer of knowledge and skills is addressed in teaching and learning. It's important to note that some accreditation criteria may be addressed solely within the narrative itself, such as the teaching pedagogy in Criterion 20 and the curriculum's local and global relevance in Criterion 28. Whereas others may require the provision of additional information to assist Speech Pathology Australia Accreditor evaluation, for example via mandatory templates or subject or unit outlines, etc. A clear program outline is critical, which details each of your courses across all semesters and years of your program. As you can see from this example of a fictional master's program, colour coding really helps. For example, using different colours for practice education, academic and foundation knowledge courses such as anatomy. It's also important to include separate program outlines for different streams, such as honours versus non-honours streams. Speech Pathology Australia is committed to implementing an outcomes-focused accreditation. The accreditation panel will evaluate the university's accreditation submission and the detailed claims made by the university, particularly in relation to how the assessments throughout the program address the accreditation standards and criteria. The strength and contribution of the program's assessments to overall claims against the accreditation standards and criteria are considered in relation to what is termed the dimensions of evidence. Programs should consider these dimensions when completing templates 6 and 7 in Part 3. More detailed explanations and practical advice regarding the dimensions of evidence can be found in Appendix 1 of Part 2. At this point, it's important to remember that accreditors see each dimension of evidence as a single piece of a larger puzzle, and accreditors integrate this information to develop an overall view of the program. Please note that in the following slides, we speak to selected points in relation to dimensions of evidence. So please refer to the appendix for a comprehensive list of prompt questions to assist in your reflection of the dimensions of evidence. The first dimension of evidence relates to the type of assessment. This needs to be clearly stated such that an accreditor can determine the level of authenticity relating to an individual assessment. For example, a written exam would generally be considered to present low authenticity relative to a practical or high-quality simulation which aims to closely replicate clinical scenarios. Of course, each assessment is viewed in light of other assessments for that subject or unit, but also in light of the other dimensions of evidence. For example, although written exams may be seen as having a lower level of authenticity, a well-designed written exam that is case-based, whole of cohort, must pass, and with passing criteria at a standard suitable for entry to the profession, would be considered to significantly contribute to a program's core claims of competency. The second dimension of evidence relates to the timing of assessment. This includes clear detail about where in the program the assessment occurs, how it relates to previous and future learning, and opportunities for student scaffolding and support. Accreditors are seeking confirmation that the timing of assessments enables students to demonstrate independent skill without unnecessary scaffolding, which compromises assurances of student competency. For example, if the passing criteria for an assessment early in the program required a level of skill suitable for entry to the profession, then accreditors may question whether the assessment is fair for students at that stage of the program with limited content, knowledge, and skill. As another example, if an assessment late in the program requires a level of skill suitable for entry to the profession, and students are provided with time to access additional supports from peers and/or other sources, this may be seen to compromise assurances of student competency. These are, of course, just examples, and we reiterate that accreditors always view each assessment in a holistic manner within the context of the whole program and the other dimensions of evidence. The degree to which the examples just discussed are or are not appropriate would therefore be influenced by these factors. The next dimensions of evidence are considered together as they all relate to the robustness of the assessment. Accreditors attend to each of these dimensions carefully when viewing assessment pieces, particularly those at a level suitable for entry to the profession. The level of assessment should be clearly specified. Where assessments are claimed to be entry level, there should be clear evidence of this level of expectation of students within the task description. We remind you of the definition of a student who is ready to enter the profession is provided in Part 2 on page 11. It's important to note that if you're claiming an assessment assesses students at a level suitable for entry to the profession, then the minimum criteria required to pass the assessment must align with this level. Assessments where entry-level expectations only align with higher grades, such as a credit or distinction, would not be considered as meeting the criteria for an entry-level assessment. Accreditors will also take note of whether assessments are whole of cohort and must pass. That is, that all students experience the same assessment content and delivery and are assessed against the same marking criteria or rubric as their peers, and that they are required to pass the assessment to pass the subject or unit or to progress in the program. It's worth noting that all assessments listed in Template 6 need to be must pass, whole of cohort, and assessed at a standard suitable for entry to the profession. We reiterate that it is not Speech Pathology Australia's intention that all of your assessments and associated marking rubrics need to reflect a standard consistent with readiness to enter the profession. Where you are claiming this, however, the task description, the skills required of the student, and the rubric used to evaluate students' performance do need to reflect this standard. Of note, there are other elements that accreditors will consider when evaluating the strength of an assessment, and these will be discussed in the following slides. Following on from the earlier point about the timing of assessments, independence is another dimension of evidence which relates to a program's assurances that students have independently demonstrated their skills. Accreditors will note whether an assessment is an individual or group task from a program's description of the assessment. Group assessments have value in contributing to a student's development of teamwork and other skills, however, do not contribute to assurances of a student's individual level of competency. Related to independence is the degree of support, scaffolding, or supervision provided or available to students before or during the assessment task. Accreditors want to know that the level of support available is commensurate with their stage of competency development, and that such support will not challenge claims of readiness to enter the profession. Accreditors are seeking evidence that the complexity of assessment tasks increases as students progress through the program. This complexity may be evidenced in tasks which require more analysis, problem solving and reasoning, and integration of skills, knowledge and attributes, rather than assessment of discrete or isolated skills. This level of complexity provides stronger evidence of the competency level required to enter the profession. For example, an assessment in the initial stages of a program may require students to recall knowledge related to a specific communication impairment. This knowledge may also be required at a later stage of the program in assessments with more complexity, whereby students must apply and integrate their knowledge to demonstrate clinical reasoning. In keeping with the definition of communication and swallowing detailed in Part 2 on page 11 and articulated in criteria 22 and 23, accreditors are seeking confirmation that students have been taught the theoretical constructs that underpin speech pathology practice across the lifespan relating to all components of communication and swallowing. Accreditors need to be assured that the curriculum provides students with opportunities to learn and apply knowledge related to communication and swallowing across the lifespan. Linked to teaching is assessment, and accreditors need assurance that students' competency development is assessed appropriately and that this occurs across the domains and standards of the professional standards. Therefore, accreditors want to see evidence that students' capacity to assess, analyse, plan, implement, and evaluate intervention have been assessed within the academic program. Such evidence could span earlier assessments through to later assessments that capture entry-level skills. Accreditors will also consider where similar content has been assessed at other points in the program and how this relates to claims against the accreditation standards. For example, page 69 of Part 2 provides an example of assessment on intervention planning in various units in Years 3 and 4 of a program, but in different areas of communication and swallowing. This includes planning mealtime supports for a 6-year-old, planning dysphagia intervention for an elderly person, and planning a communication intervention for a 15-year-old with a cognitive disability. In this example, knowledge and skills learned and demonstrated in one lifespan context in Year 3 may also be assessed in Year 4 in relation to a different lifespan context and a different area of practice. Accreditors are interested in how this might contribute to a program's claims of their students' readiness to enter the profession. Leading on from the previous example, universities can make claims of transfer of knowledge and skills relating to specific areas of practice across the lifespan, such as identified in the previous example, across individuals and communities, and also across domains of the professional standards. Criterion 24 directly relates to transfer of knowledge and skills and details evidence universities are required to provide. Accreditors understand that entry-level assessment is not possible for all areas of communication and swallowing across the lifespan. Therefore, universities rely on students transferring knowledge and skills across contexts in all areas. Accreditors want to know how programs discuss transfer with students and support them to do this. Accreditors are looking for claims of transfer that are both realistic and reasonable in scope. An absolutely critical consideration here is that accreditors cannot assume where claims of transfer may apply. Therefore, universities need to make explicit statements regarding any claims of transfer, together with supporting evidence for those claims. In Video Guide 4, transfer was extensively discussed, including key considerations of how transfer may be conceptualized with reference to supporting evidence. Practice education experiences are a critical contributor to students' learning of professional practice skills. Accreditors therefore want to know that the practice education experiences students have are integrated with their academic curriculum and are well planned and monitored across a developmental trajectory towards entry-level competency. Accreditors are seeking evidence that students have a range of practice education experiences, with clients presenting with communication and swallowing difficulties across the lifespan and with communities in a range of contexts. With regard to monitoring of this range of experiences, it is important that universities are not reliant on this being completed by students. Accreditors seek assurance that universities have a range of placements available to students and that students have been assessed validly by practice educators who are supported to provide quality learning and make valid assessment decisions. Passing requirements need to be clear to students and to practice educators, who also need to understand how support for difficulties within the placement can be accessed and what it means if a student fails a placement. How are decisions made regarding the availability of extensions, supplementary placement, or repeat of placement? We draw your attention to specific requirements of practice education experiences, which are addressed in criteria 31 and 32. Accreditors are seeking assurance that students are assessed at near entry level and then entry level in their penultimate and final placements of their program. In addition, universities are required to confirm that students undertake the majority of placements in Australia with service users and practice educators who reside in Australia, and that they are assessed by practice educators who hold or are eligible for certified practicing speech pathologist status. At least one near entry level penultimate or entry level placement needs to be in Australia, which includes in-person, face-to-face service delivery. Lastly, the majority of placements need to be with real rather than simulated service users. A university's commitment to culturally safe and responsive practice with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities needs to be evident in their submission. A number of criteria address this commitment, and accreditors are seeking assurance that universities, both currently and in future plans, are working towards meaningful engagement and partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities to build staff and student understanding of culturally safe and responsive practice. This includes evidence relating to extending staff capability, recruiting and retaining Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, facilitating access to cultural support where required, and working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities to build curriculum and offer practice education experiences. Accreditors need to be assured that students who speak English as an additional language are supported to undertake their program successfully. Specifically, they require evidence of how a student's communication competency is evaluated across reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and how students are supported to demonstrate the English language skills that underpin speech pathology practice. Where supports are required, accreditors want to know that this is identified early in the program and that appropriate supports are available and provided, with monitoring of outcomes also required. So, what are accreditors looking for overall? A good submission has clear, concise writing within well-formatted, easy-to-navigate documents with good cross-referencing and electronic links where relevant. All mandatory components must be included. All criteria from 1 to 41 should be addressed comprehensively with attention to all evidence required as documented in Template 8. The submission should show evidence of students demonstrating on graduation competencies suitable for entry to the profession. This will include clear mapping of must-pass whole-of-cohort assessments suitable for entry to the profession, descriptions of entry-level tasks and marking rubrics, and full coverage of the domains and standards within the professional standards. Accreditors also need to see clear mapping of all other key assessments which contribute to claims for accreditation. Claims of transfer of knowledge and skills are explicit, realistic, and reasonable in scope. An insufficient submission could result in an unfavourable outcome for the university or a significant delay in decision-making about an accreditation outcome. Common submission issues include poor formatting, which impacts readability and accreditors' ability to find and triangulate evidence. A reminder that careful completion of all templates 1 to 8 is mandatory. In Template 8, required evidence for each individual criterion is listed, all of which must be addressed within a university's submission. Where evidence is missing or only partially addressed, accreditors would require further information before making inclusively reviewing evidence. The importance of whole-of-cohort and must-pass assessments have already been emphasised. As such, where universities submit as evidence assessments which do not meet these criteria as evidence for readiness for entry to the profession, accreditors will not be able to accept such claims. Similarly, accreditors will require clarification where claimed assessment level and marking criteria do not align. While some claims of transfer are expected, accreditors will question submission where there is an over-reliance on transfer as evidence of core claims of entry-level competency. And accreditors are looking for authentic embedding of key elements such as culturally safe and responsive practice throughout a program, rather than such content being limited to isolated discrete units of study. Speech Pathology Australia recognises the importance of quality university programs to ensure the development of a future quality workforce. Speech Pathology Australia is available for consultation and is here to support you in your preparation and submission of accreditation documentation. Accreditation is everyone's business. Speech Pathology Australia urges universities to review all written and video resources and to make these available to their staff. It's important that staff know how their teaching and assessment contributes to the evidence for accreditation, to student readiness to enter the profession, and to claims of transfer. Staff also need to understand how key concepts relating to accreditation, for example, evidence-based practice, are threaded throughout the curriculum. Please also refer to the other accreditation video guides available.